It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Keith Magee. Keith Magee is a visiting researcher at the Center for Practical Theology at Boston University School of Theology and a senior fellow on race, religion, and poverty at the University of Birmingham Institute of Advanced Studies and a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts in the UK. Keith is a trained economist and religious scholar. His research began with his own interest in religious history, considering migrant narratives, ethnographic studies, and poverty. More specifically, the consideration of interrupting generational poverty, where the poor can see and experience life differently. This evening, Professor Magee will speak to us about Strength to Love, Global Justice for the Poor. Welcome.
Good evening. Good evening. My colleague Diana Swancott has given some data, but I want to just revisit some as I share with you this Strength to Love, Global Justice for the Poor, looking at England's civic gospel, the United States social gospel, and how King emerges between the two. Almost half of the world, as my colleague has already shared, over 3 billion people live on less than $2 a day. 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 a day. The poorest 40% of the world's population counts for 5% of the global income. The richest 20% accounts for 3/4 of the world's income. According to UNICEF, 22,000 children die each day due to poverty, and they die quietly in some of the poorest villages on earth, far removed from the scrutiny and the conscious world. Some 1.1 billion people in developing countries have inadequate access to water, and 2.6 billion people lack basic sanitation. Approximately 790 million people in the developing world are still chronically undernourished, almost 2/3 of whom reside in Asia and the Pacific. Dr. King was aware of the glaring statistics of his day, and while fighting for the plight of the American Negro, he understood that one could not just be concerned with the soul of the individual, but also needed to be concerned about the holistic well-being of the entire person, the mind, the body, and spirit. And thus, his message of liberation to the poor and deliverance to the captives from the bondages of racism, classism, economic and social oppression was infused with his understanding of the gospel, the good news. He understood the gospel was to serve as a model for those seeking solutions to societal ills. Therefore, King enlarged the gospel, navigating between the sacred and the secular. To consider him only to be a national spiritual civil rights leader is to marginalize him, because he was, in fact, an international human rights leader. His pulpit was on a global stage with a lectern used to deliver the gospel's message beyond salvation, but to that of equality and justice for the poor. King had influencers who paved the way for him. In the mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s, in England, George Dawson, a nonconformist preacher, lecturer, and advocate, and the son of a Baptist school headmaster, developed the concept of England's civic gospel. It is of particular interest to note that this civic gospel in the United Kingdom emerges from its second city named Birmingham. Dawson called upon his congregation to join him in the struggle to, quote, improve the conditions of towns and the quality of life enlarged by its citizens. His sermons were unconventional for the time. It is said that Dawson preached not as a dying man to dying men, but he had the idea that he was to preach to a living man to preach a living man to living men who found no simple or easy matters as it related to life. Dawson's understanding of the gospel, the good news, was electrified in his sermons and brought unrest to Birmingham's public. And it also brought unrest to influential members that were in his church, those who paved the way significantly to roles in local affairs, took on his ideas. The formation of the civic gospel in its maturest form was the argument that a city was a closer and more significant form of community than a nation or a religion. And thus it was a municipality, more than a parliament or a church, that had most to contribute to the health, the welfare, and fairness of urban society. In the early 20th century, around 1917, in the United States, there was the uprising of the social gospel. One of the defining theologians for the social gospel movement was Walter Washenbush, a Baptist pastor of a congregation located in Manhattan's Hell's Kitchen. Washenbush, in a Theology for the Social Gospel, writes, "The social gospel needs a theology to make it effective, but a theology needs the social gospel to make it vital." The social gospel then applied Christian ethics to social problems, especially issues of social justice, such as economic inequality, poverty, crime, child labor, inadequate labor unions, poor schools, and the danger of war. Rauschenbusch rallied against what he regarded as the selfishness of capitalism and promoted a form of Christian socialism that supported the creation of labor unions and a cooperative society. Both the civic and the social gospel, then, the civic being liberal theology with a social and political vision of civic brotherhood, and the social being Christian ethics to solve problems, especially issues of social justice, only separated by decades and the Atlantic Ocean, infuses the good news of justice for the oppressed and the poor. Embedded with this notion of the gospel, Martin Luther King brought the message of liberation to the poor and deliverance of captives from the bondage of racism, classism, and economic oppression. Both Dawson and Rauschenbusch understood the need to serve in politics as civic duty and to serve God as a matter of service. They understood the need to bridge the gap between spiritual work and the work of the real world. King was impacted by their theology because its rationalization in applying theology to the world. King was concerned, again, not just for the individual, but for the holistic well-being of the entire person, the mind, the body, and the spirit. The dichotomy between the sacred and the secular emerges in King's theology. It moved him away from just being a civil rights leader and catapulted him into the world stage with a message of love and hope that change could come for the oppressed. King, however, was not only affected by the great theologians of the day, he was also influenced by a black church and his lineage in the black church tradition, particularly the Baptist church, in which both Dawson and Rauschenbusch were rooted. King's God enabled him to see the interrelatedness of all humankind. In Strength to Love, he wrote, "In a real sense, all life is integrated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." King was at the forefront, and in some ways, I propose, a pioneer of interreligious dialogue, not just in America, but around the globe. He adopted Gandhi's nonviolence philosophy. King also saw that we are not so much disunited as we are disconnected. King's theology, I contend, then caused him to make an impact in both the secular and the sacred arena. Understanding King's theology is relevant today because, first, he was a gospeler who understood the call to serve humanity. One of the central things King did from the sacred lens was to bring the black church to the public arena, giving it prominence. Within the black community, the church served as an institutional base for social, political, and economic survival. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus to a white patron in 1955, it was the black church and its leadership that was able to organize and rally the masses to boycott the segregated transportation system in the city. The black church then becomes called upon from the various places around the world as a critical voice as it comes to social equality. Clergy, representing various denominations still today, are invited to the White House and serve on boards and hold elected offices and are involved in many economic development programs in their respective communities. The church then becomes the organism for King not only to preach from the sacred text, but to also provide leadership to the movement. And like Dawson and Rauschenbusch, to elevate the statue of Christian clergy beyond the pulpit to the problems of the people, namely the problems of poverty, inequality, and injustice. Whereas the civic and the social gospel raised the consciousness of a people of faith to the issues of the day, the civil rights movement, or the civil rights gospel, if you will, gave birth to committed and dedicated human rights trailblazers and produced leaders that gained national and international reputations. King infused the discourse of civil and human rights and linked them to the international peace movement. In doing so, he projected an African-American alternative approach to international relations, international law based on nonviolence and a profound, clear insight of love for humans and all humanity. He borrowed from the natural law doctrine and repudiated international relations doctrines based on the balance of power and the innate sovereign hostility. King's human rights leadership emerges in the movement against South African apartheid in 1960. It was accelerated by his receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and it grew prominent when he opposed the Vietnam War in 1965 and reached its apex in doctrine in his great Beyond Vietnam, a time to break the silent speech at the Riverside Church in New York in 1967. He stated, "My conscience leaves me no other choice." King went on to say in his speech that, and as I ponder the madness of Vietnam and search within myself for ways to understand and respond to the compassion, my mind goes constantly to the people of the peninsula. I speak now not of the soldiers on each side, but simply of the people who have been living under the curse of war for almost 3 continuous decades now. I think of them too because it is clear to me that there will be no meaningful solution there until some attempt is made to know them and to hear their broken hearts. In his fight for global justice for the oppressed and poor, he continued to plan a national march against poverty in the United States, but he had a global lens. He navigated the world emphasizing economic rights and human rights and co-equaled with political and civil rights, and we know he died. He was assassinated in Memphis in 1968 with this belief. King borrowed from and was influenced in his work and nonviolence principles by the international work of prophets like Du Bois in Ghana, Gandhi in India, Paul Robeson and Philip Randolph. As we come here tonight to address King and the problem of poverty and commemorating him, we must understand 2 fundamental principles that he lived by that brought impact to the poor. First, we must understand what it means to have the strength to love. both in that which is sacred and in that which is secular. King's teachings and writings reflected his deep understanding of the need for agape, a love that is concerned with going the extra mile to ensure the well-being of others. King believed in a better world, but in order to attain his vision, we must first face our fears and then master these fears through courage, love, and faith. He preached of courage that should show through nonviolence how to stand against segregation, and he believed that all people could possess the strength of courage because all people were made in the image of God. This courage is the strength to hope for better days. This strength is to have faith as King would believe it in the Lord, and most of all, the strength to love all of God's children, no matter their skin color or their difference. Second, we must understand the role and the assignment of the prophet, as King was a prophet, much like Dawson and Rauschenbusch along with Gandhi. The English word prophet comes from the Greek meaning advocate. Advocacy is the political process by an individual or group which aims to influence decisions within political, economic, and social systems and institutions. Within the religious order, we understand prophets are those people who speak on behalf of God and his people to the nation as advocates. Therefore, prophets have the God-given assignment to shake the status quo. Prophets have the distinct duty and responsibility to straighten things out. King, as a prophet, embraced preaching and advocacy as one. He understood that the two fed and informed the other. At the heart of his message was the view of the gospel that rejected a truncated spirituality, but that only sought to save souls while ignoring bodies and focusing narrowly on matters of private morality instead of the issues of morality implicating the public policy of all. In Love and Action, King lamented, "One of the greatest tragedies of life is that men seldom bridge the gulf between practice and profession, between doing and saying. A persistent schizophrenia leaves so many of us tragically divided amongst ourselves. How often are our lives categorized by a high blood pressure of creeds and an amnesia of deeds? We talk eloquently about our commitment to the principles of Christianity, and yet our lives are saturated with the problems and the practices of paganism. We proclaim devotion to democracy, but we sadly practice the opposite of the democratic creed. We talk passionately about peace, and at the same time, we assiduously prepare for war. We make our fervent pleas for the high road of justice, and then we tread unflinchingly the low road of injustice. The strange dichotomy," King says, "is this agonizing gulf between ought to and the is. It presents this tragic theme of man's earthly pilgrimage." My question for us as a group gathered here today on this MLK Day, how do we collectively rise up as prophets with strength to love, to impact global change, global poverty, as Martin did? Thank you. Yes.
So you talk a lot about the history of the Black church and social justice being intertwined, which is very important. How do you think today, though, that the African American church can allow to progress social justice for Black atheists and agnostics and other Black non-believers?
I need the mic, right? I think that the Black church can do that by embracing, as King did, and as I argue, the whole being, the whole person beyond theology to understand who we are in mind, heart, and spirit. And I think the Black church has a long way to go with that, to understand that we are more alike than we are different. So I think there's a large discourse that can take place in the church.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your speech. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask, you talked about Dawson using the municipality of the church and parliament and sort of the values that compromise, or what values might need to be compromised to sort of bridge the gap between secular and sacred love, and sort of what might be needed to achieve those socio-political goals.
Well, I think a number of things. When we think of faith institutions, we have to think of ourselves as those, as Dawson did in England, as an entity that informed the secular based upon what the sacred meant. So for Dawson, when being trained as a Baptist and then Unitarian, understood, as much as I was arguing relating to King, how the whole being was essential, and that it was the role of the sacred institutions to inform, even though there was even though we now have this idea of the separation of church and state, bringing those two realities together to take care of the whole being. So that now I think that one of the things to do is to make sure that the church is informing more around social policy, in that it is taking care of people in a very particular way. It's hard to see you all.
Hi. In your speech, you spoke about Dr. King's insistence that we must hope for a better day and a better future. And I was wondering if you thought that there was a cynicism in the generation of us students here at BU that might be our greatest challenge in achieving that.
I am encouraged by the generation that you all represent. I have seen some remarkable things. Of course, we know the tragedies that have faced us in this last year, between Ferguson and Staten Island. And what I have seen with the movement of students, not only here at BU, but around the globe, is inspiring and encouraging. And so everything I would have to say is positive. Keep doing what you're doing. It is this interrelatedness of who you are and what you represent that will bring about the type of change that we need in this world. Thank you all.